This is the fifth time I've given a lecture under this title, though always the content has been different. And the reason that I have done it is because I feel a kind of urgency about the issue. Indeed, the first time I gave the lecture was about this time last year to the Melbourne Writers' Festival, to which I'd been invited to talk about something else. And for the first time, after many appearances at that festival, I asked to be given a standalone lecture, which also had this title, but as I say, quite different in its content. That's available actually on YouTube. The Monthly also filmed that. The Monthly's here tonight. The expression "a common humanity," or the ways in which we talk about humanity in what I tend to call ethically inflected tones or tones of moral resonance, have become quite common nowadays. But the ethical resonances of it are various, and one of the things I want to talk about tonight is the variety of those ethical resonances. That's still my phone going. More often than not, when we use an expression or refer to the idea of a common humanity, it's to lament the failure of its acknowledgement. The forms of that failure are depressingly many: racism, sexism, homophobia, the dehumanization of our enemies, of unrepentant criminals, and those who suffer severe and degrading affliction. As often as someone reminds us that we are all human beings, someone will reply that to be treated like a human being, you have first to behave like one. Each, of course, there are two kinds of explanations for this, and each has its place. One assumes that we retain a pretty firm hold on the idea that all the peoples of the earth share a common humanity, but for various psychological and social and moral reasons fail to live up to our acknowledgement of it. And the other suggests that the very idea of a common humanity waxes and wanes with us at times, when we dehumanize our enemies or are vulnerable to racism, for example. On those occasions, it may become literally unintelligible to us. I mean vulnerable to racism, I mean vulnerable to becoming racist, not vulnerable to the effects of racists upon us. And there are also other reasons why we might think the concept is, in various ways, a dodgy one. And some of those reasons were explored in this theatre last week by Ghassan Hajj. And normally I give the first of these lectures, but for various reasons, Ghassan did so last week. And I'm covering, and I had always intended to cover, much of the same conceptual ground, but offering a rather different perspective on it. Those of you who were here last week will, I hope, recognize that ground and the difference of perspective. Well, racism is again on the rise in many parts of the world, and so is dehumanization, in some cases demonization of our enemies. They've come together in attitudes to ISIS and have spread to Muslims and some immigrants as effortlessly as water flowing downwards in a channel. And for that reason, and now I'm listing, as it were, the fears that have prompted my sense of the urgency of this topic. For that reason, many people appear now to fear that perhaps within 10 years or so, national and international politics will be dominated by crises that are caused and inflamed by the shameful gap between rich and poor nations, aggravated by the effects of climate change. Deepening political instability in many regions of the earth may cause even more people to be uprooted than were uprooted last century. That now seems to be becoming pretty evident. And strong nations are likely to protect themselves in ways that become increasingly brutal, testing the relevance and the authority of international law. It is, I believe, almost certain that my grandchildren's generation will not be protected as mine has been from the terrors suffered by most of the peoples of the earth because of impoverishment, natural disasters, and the evils inflicted upon them by other human beings. More and more, I fear, the reality of affliction, together with unrelenting exposure to what is morally horrible, evil if you have use for that word, will test their understanding of what it means to share a common humanity with all the peoples of the earth, and to a degree almost too awful to imagine, their faith that the world is a good world despite the suffering and the evil in it. Well, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, states in its preamble that, and I quote, "The recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable right of all its members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world." It also spoke of crimes that had recently shocked the conscience of mankind. 2 years earlier, the United Nations General Assembly resolution on genocide declared genocide to be, quote, "a shock to the conscience of mankind, contrary to moral law and to the spirit and aims of the United Nations, and a crime which," I quote again, "the civilized world condemns." Yet at the time these words were written, the peoples of the European nations who drafted them and created international law in its modern form looked upon most of the peoples of the earth as primitive savages who of their very nature lacked the kind of understanding presupposed in what is meant by speaking of genocide as, quote, "a shock to the conscience of mankind," even though some of them had been the victims of colonial genocides. Racism was then, and is now, often marked by an incapacity to see depth in the lives of Black, Asians, and Central and South Americans. Some other forms of racism, of course, are different, because racism is not just one thing. Anti-Semitism is different in many ways from racism of whites towards coloured peoples. And I don't know enough about racism of coloured peoples to one another and towards whites. But at issue in the kind of racism I'll be talking about tonight is not the truth of factual stereotypes to which racists often appeal in order to justify their attitudes, but rather the meaning that they're able to see or fail to see in the lives of the people they denigrate. When James Isdell, a protector of Aborigines in Western Australia in the 1930s, was asked how he felt when he took children of mixed blood from their mothers, he answered that, quote, "he would not hesitate for a moment to separate any half-caste from its Aboriginal mother, no matter how frantic her momentary grief might be at the time. They, quote, soon forget their offspring," he explained. It was literally unintelligible to him that they could grieve as we do, that grief for a dead child could lacerate a black woman's soul for the remainder of her life. I first thought about this in a response to a real example, a woman I called M when I first wrote about her in A Common Humanity. Last week, Ghassan, when he explained why he alluded to an example he had often repeated, he said that he was good at milking his examples. And when I thought about this lecture and Ghassan's claim in his lecture that the idea of a common humanity or the concept of a common humanity is a white concept infected by racism and exploitation, I thought I'd elaborate this example and its conceptual features, which I think are instructive. I'm going to elaborate a certain kind of perception of a certain kind of racist perception, but I don't, and its conceptual features. But I don't, of course. I shouldn't say, of course. I don't, anyhow. want to deny that it has psychological, social and political causes and effects. Well, the woman I'm talking about, M, was staying with us in London because her son had been killed. He fell off a cliff in Scotland. And while she was grieving and waiting for the post-mortem results, she watched a television show in which you could see, or in which she saw, the grief of Vietnamese mothers whose children had been killed in American bombing raids. And at first she moved towards the television, sitting in her chair as though to express with those women a sense of shared suffering. But it didn't take long at all for her to sit back and say, well, it's different for them. They can just have more. Well, it's important to see that M didn't intend hers to be an empirical or factual remark that she might retract when at less emotionally turbulent times she could attend to whatever evidence is relevant to its empirical status. She didn't mean, for example, that the Vietnamese had been brutalized by war for so long that life had become cheap for them. But later, after the war, they would again be like us, finding it ethically impossible to have children as though they were replaceable, just as we do. If she'd intended it as an empirical generalization, she might have conceded even then that she would have to allow for exceptions. When M said of the Vietnamese that they could just have more, she implied, obviously, that she could not, and that the impossibility was of a kind that I would call ethical. It partially defined her identity as an individual, that sense that she could not and they could, and obviously as part of us, distinguished from them. If she were asked who belonged to us and who to them, she'd have no clear idea of how to answer. If questioned, she might try to defend her racism by appeal to empirical claims, to racialist stereotypes about the Vietnamese or other Asians and Africans to whom she takes the same attitude. But that would just disguise, even to herself perhaps, what really informs her attitude. She is probably to some degree factually ignorant about the people she denigrates, but more importantly, she's blind to the meaning in their lives. Not to the meaning of this or that, but to the fact that their lives have the kind of meanings that her life has, and the life of those she includes amongst us. And I express this in my discussion by her saying that by saying in this discussion that from her perspective, we grieve, and Isdel's perspective, to take the same example, we grieve, but they, inverted commas, grieve. We love, but they, inverted commas, love, and so on, in regard to virtually everything that they feel and do. The inverted commas register the fact that her radical failure to see the reality of their lives is not an ordinary sense of failure to see facts about or the logical consequences of those facts. We understand the nature of her blindness better if we reflect on why we can't see the full range of human expressiveness in a face that looks to us like the black and white minstrel show's caricature of African American. Elsewhere, I've said that no one could cast a face that looked like that to play Othello. That's not in any ordinary sense a failure because of a failure of her epistemic powers. Not even an omniscient God could see the full dignity of sorrow or joy in such a face. Coming to see the full range of expressiveness in faces that had all looked alike to us, or to hear the full range of feeling and thought in voices that had sounded comical to us, or to hear it in song, to see it in someone's sexuality as having a kind of depth that could make rape a violation of something precious. To do all or any of that is quite different from abandoning false empirical beliefs. The typical stereotypes that racists fall back on are usually abandoned, one after the other, as the argument goes against them, revealing that those stereotypes were not what really motivated them in the first place, nor did they express the way they failed to see their victims as they really are. And that's why they're called rationalizations in the pejorative meaning of that expression. Well, despite its many ambiguities, sometimes hypocrisies and mystifications, the discovery by the Western intelligentsia of the moral or spiritual depth in practices and beliefs that had previously seemed only to express the superstitions of scientifically backward savages is one of the admirable achievements of the latter half of the 20th century. But as I've suggested, that discovery was not, for the most part, based on empirical or straightforwardly empirical observation or showing empirical beliefs expressed in racialist stereotypes to be false. It was the discovery that the culture of Indigenous peoples possessed, as the great Australian anthropologist W.H. Stanner put it, all the beauty of song, mime, dance and art of which human beings are capable. It amounted, that's the end of the quote, it amounted to a new capacity to see in black cultures an ever-deepening responsiveness to the defining facts of the human condition, to our mortality, our sexuality, our vulnerability to misfortune, and therefore to see them as cultures from which we could learn. Like us, they love rather than love, grieve rather than grieve. Like us, each is unique and irreplaceable, and therefore, like us, they cannot just have more. I want to say something about that cannot, that what I called ethical impossibility, when she says they can just have more, implying, of course, that she cannot. And two important points emerge from a reflection on it. First, it doesn't express an impossibility that assumes that she cannot do it no matter how hard she tried. If it assumed that, then it would make sense for someone to wonder whether she tried hard enough to overcome whatever psychological or social inhibitions prevented her from having a child pretty much immediately afterwards, perhaps by seeing a psychoanalyst or something like that. Socrates made the point a long time ago, I think, when he said to a young orator who shamelessly boasted of the power his oratory gave him to get what he wanted from people, that he had forgotten his geometry. It's a strange thing to say, you might think at first, but what he meant, I think, is that there are analogies with ethical and mathematical limits, because neither is a limit imposed by force or power. Someone else's strength might be, or as one's psychological incapacities or desires or compulsions might be. I can't get her out of my mind. That's one kind of impossibility. I can't betray her expresses another. In the first, one might recommend ways of overcoming what a person thinks prevents him or her from doing what they want to do. In the second, to suggest anything of the kind betrays a deep misunderstanding of what's at issue. It's as though when Martin Luther said, "Here I stand, I can do no other," someone were to suggest to him, "Why don't you try, Martin? It might not be as hard as you think." Well, the second point is this, that though it goes deep with her and indeed defines her identity, as I said before, as an individual and as part of us, as part of what distinguishes us from them, it's not moral impossibility. It will perhaps have been evident by now that I don't equate ethics with morality. And though the distinction between morality and ethics is an old one, there's no agreed agreement about how to draw it. I think of the ethical as a realm in which we think about how to live, about the meanings of things in our lives. We think about morality then, of course, but also about law or politics and other matters. about the demands intrinsic to the various forms of love and how to rise to them, for example. I think of these, as I'll try to explain, as distinctive realms of value, sui generis in complex ways, interconnected, sometimes in conflict. Love in all its forms has ethical standards intrinsic to it, standards that distinguish love from its many counterfeits. Love of one's friends may conflict with love of country, both with morality, morality with politics, both with law. So though I write in the singular of the ethical, I wouldn't do so of the values in its domain. There are many conceptions of morality, for example, not only of what to do, but also of what it is, what kind of place it can or should have in our lives. The same is true for all the forms of the ethical. Betrayal, murder, cruelty, they're examples of moral wrongs. When Socrates said that it's better to suffer evil than to do it, he had such wrongs in mind, amongst others, of course. But when he said he couldn't give up philosophizing, even under the threat of death, because, as he put it, an unexamined life is not worthy of a human being, he expressed a sense of ethical impossibility, but it would go against the grain to call it moral impossibility. Like Socrates, some people believe that they must live their lives with lucidity for reasons that are not prudential. They may believe that they must seek a truthful understanding of their past, but not because they hope it'll have obviously practical benefits for the future. Others believe that understanding the past matters only insofar as it serves the future. Again, to hark back to the distinction I made talking about M, from the first perspective, the second might look superficial, but hardly immoral. When we see aspects of racism from the perspective I've sketched, M's perspective, it's almost irresistible to believe that racists look upon the victims of their denigration as shallow by virtue of their race. But M does not see the Vietnamese as shallow. This is a very important point. Rather, she does not see them as even existing in a conceptual space in which attributions of depth and shallowness make sense. And that's one of the most important lessons that reflection on this aspect of racism can teach us. To be shallow, you have to be able to rise to something deeper, just as to be irrational, you have to be answerable to the claims of rationality. If one of M's white friends had a child in the circumstances and in the spirit that M thinks the Vietnamese do, M would reprimand her. How can you do this, she'd demand. You have babies like the Vietnamese and the blacks do, she'd say. Or if one of her neighbours, brain damaged after an accident, intentionally conceived only a month or so after one of her children had died, M would not think of her as being contingently beyond such criticism. M would think of her as being accidentally, contingently beyond such criticism, no longer answerable to the demand she tries to rise to something deeper, but she'll think of her still as one of us because her neighbour is that way due to misfortune. M doesn't think of the Vietnamese as victims of misfortune. When she thinks we grieve, but they grieve, she thinks that's how they are essentially. Simone Weil's remark that if we could see other human beings as a perspective on the world just as we are, then we could not treat them unjustly. That's obviously an ethically loaded sense of perspective, morally loaded indeed. Or perhaps better, a perspective which presupposes the conditions of what we call morality. At any rate, it means more than being a centre of consciousness, and more than M could mean if she said to somebody, look, you have to see it from their perspective, the Vietnamese. They can just have more. To see another as a perspective on the world as they meant it, you need to see them as living with you in a conversational space in which you are in various ways, not necessarily discursively, open indeed answerable, to the concepts that determine whether you seriously try to be lucid about things that mean most to you as a human being. What counts really as love rather than as counterfeits? What counts as humility rather than civility? What it means to die with dignity and lucidity, and so on. And as I hope the example of M makes clear, interdependently with all that, what it means to be wronged, as we know we can be. You have to see them as being able to converse about these matters. Converse in a loaded sense, in which we mean it when we exclaim joyfully, "At last I found someone to talk to." And intrinsic to such conversation is what I call the ever-present possibility of a call to seriousness. Come now, you can't mean that. Be serious. Think. Don't yield so easily to your tendency to sentimentality or to pathos. Why do you have such a tin ear for irony? And so on. Note that these latter categories of criticism are important in regard to literary criticism, or criticism of the arts more generally. And to call someone to seriousness, as I mean it, is to call them to a response that individuates them, an individuating responsiveness to what they've made of their lives, and therefore of themselves. To call them to speak out of a life that they've lived as their own, not anybody else's. But of course, conversation is not always like this. God forbid that it should be. But even the most trivial conversation can turn in unexpected ways in that direction, making such a call necessary under pain of evasion, sometimes an offence against the loving severity necessary to real friendship. To belong to that conversational space, to be in that way answerable to one another, is a condition of being someone who can grieve rather than grieve, love rather than love. It's also a condition of possessing the values with which ethical necessities and impossibilities are interdependent. What I ethically can't do, perhaps you can. But when M said they can just have more, she didn't mean that they had an ethical perspective different from hers on what it means to have children, to love and to lose them. She meant they live in a world that knows nothing of ethical necessities and impossibilities. It's therefore inconceivable to M that she could seriously converse with Vietnamese mothers about what it means to have and to lose a child, or about anything that matters deeply to her. Obviously, some beings, through misfortune, are not able or no longer able to be answerable to a call to lucidity, and therefore no longer can occupy such a conversational space. But if they're human beings, they are so through misfortune. If they're one of us, they are so through misfortune. And obviously that makes a difference, as I said before, on how Vietnamese looks upon us, how she looks upon them, and how we look upon animals. Obviously, as far as we know, only human beings are the beings we know and can share conversational space in the way that I've identified as being intrinsically vulnerable to a call to seriousness. Although Vicky Hearn and some other writers have convincingly suggested that there can be attenuated forms of it amongst animals. But nothing we can learn about animals will change that. And unlike the case between human beings, we can't characterize important differences between human beings and animals as being due to misfortune that animals have suffered individually or as a species. But if M's incapacity to see the Vietnamese as occupying such a space with her is inseparable from her incapacity to see that they can be wronged as we can be, then that shows something important about our understanding of what it means to wrong someone, when our sense of that is not infected by racist or other dehumanizing perceptions of them. And from that we can see the interdependencies between ethical modalities that are not moral ones. As I said, M doesn't think that it's immoral to have a child in the way that the Vietnamese do. We can see the interdependencies between ethical modalities that are not moral ones and modalities of necessity and impossibility in moral contexts, as when somebody says, I can't do this, it would be a terrible betrayal. And if that's so, then it's implausible, I think, to suggest that were M to have reflected on the fact that she never doubted that the Vietnamese were rational beings and persons with interests and desires and people who could reflect on their desires, it's implausible to suggest that if she acknowledged that she acknowledges that she would have seen, following a train of thought through carefully, that really they can be wronged as we can be. Is it plausible that she could derive from her acknowledgement that they're rational beings with interests or persons, that she could derive principles that we would call moral principles, yet still believe that we love, but they love in inverted commas? Be a human being for once in your life is not an injunction to be more fully a member of the species, Homo sapiens. Nor did Socrates mean that an unexamined life is not worthy of the species, Homo sapiens. Sometimes such ethical inflections are the expressions of morality, and sometimes they're not, as I've said. Always, reference to humanity functions not as an explanation of why someone should do something, but as an ethical reminder of what it means to be human. One might there wonder how much the concept of humanity helps us to understand the ethical resonances associated with it. Perhaps the real ethical work, we might think, the real conceptual work is done by the concept of a person or a rational agent. I've already suggested that they probably won't do, but the reason they're attractive is that they're concepts that don't conflict, as the ethically inflected ways of speaking of our humanity appear to, don't conflict with the obvious possibility that beings who are not human beings, aliens for example, or one day robots, might become fully part of our ethical community, including our moral community. At issue here, it's important to see, is not whether the characteristic lives of human beings generates ethical content for human beings. Obviously, that's true. The more fundamental question concerning morality is this: is the concept of humanity necessary to our understanding of what it means to wrong someone, of what it means to be morally necessitated in ways I characterized earlier, and therefore to the understanding of the distinctive kind of seriousness that morality can have in our lives? In none of its ethical inflections, I think, is humanity a natural kind concept, which is to say that if it turned out that being towards whom, I mean, this might really surprise you, but I'll say it nonetheless. You might find this absolutely incredible. I'm happy to discuss it afterwards. If it turned out that beings towards whom we behaved as though they are human beings were in fact not members of the species Homo sapiens, we would not therefore, or not thereby believe that we'd been mistaken in treating them as human beings. We would not necessarily think that either we had been mistaken in treating them as fellow human beings, or that the scientific classification of what it is to be a member of the species Homo sapiens is mistaken. The reasons for thinking this, which I've developed in some of my writings, in The Common Humanity, for example, and The Philosopher's Dog, are, I believe, to be found in Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. If I'm right in claiming that our ethically inflected ways of speaking of humanity can extend to beings who are not members of the species Homo sapiens, then one reason why people believe the concept of a person or a rational agent does the work that's carried in those reflections will lose its attractions. And so too will, I think, for those of you who know the expression, the attractions of the idea that in our relation to other animals, we tend to be speciesist. So I think that loses attractions too, if we understand this about the way in which we use the ethically inflected ways of speaking of human beings. But how distant from us those beings, with whom we might have full moral fellowship, even if they're not members of the species Homo sapiens can be, how distant from us those beings can be in their appearances and ways of living and be accepted into the fellowship of humanity cannot in principle be determined in advance by any of the theoretical studies in the natural or the social sciences, nor by discoveries or alleged discoveries of metaphysical facts, nor simply by the work of reason reflecting on, for example, rational agency. We must see how we respond. Well, is the emphasis that I've given to lucidity about our inner lives and our responses to the big defining facts of the human condition just a Eurocentric rationalist prejudice? I believe it's not, because the distinction between appearance and reality goes deep in the very constitution of the concepts that mark the forms of our inner life. I've emphasized that between human beings, we would not call something love, for example, if it were not answerable to the distinction between real love and its many counterfeits. That's true of all love in all its forms. For reasons that are many and well known, we seldom love truly. But can we imagine anyone who does not care whether they have mistaken infatuation for love, maudlin self-indulgence for grief or remorse, servility for humility, mere recklessness for courage, or jingoism for love of country? I don't, of course, mean that all human beings in all cultures are equally reflective about these matters. Some, even in the relatively discursive cultures of the West, prefer not to think about them, regarding it as self-indulgent or navel-gazing to do it. Nonetheless, they believe that they love truly, even if they make no effort to overcome the failings that sustain the illusion that they do. But really not to care? That's what I find hard to believe. We all care, I'm sure, but we usually assume that we love and grieve truly. No one wants to live without love or without being able to love. Love's false semblances, its counterfeits, are not forms of love, just as counterfeit notes are not forms of money, just worth a little bit less than the real thing. And that's one reason why truth is a need of the soul. It's hardly disputable, I think, that expressions like failing to see the humanity of peoples comes naturally in discussion of racism, of the kind M betrayed. So when today, and in what I've written, in A Common Humanity, for example, I speak of a common humanity of all the peoples of the earth, then I mean, at least in the first instance, that there are no peoples who are as M sees the Vietnamese. Given my earlier remarks in which about the context in which the Universal Declaration of Human Rights emerged, and the resurgence of racism worldwide, the importance of that affirmation can't be overstated. But in making such an affirmation, I don't, and I don't think anybody else does, imply that they understand what it is to be fully human, that they've discovered it, and wish, as Gassan suggested last week, to impose or at least convey that discovery to formerly denigrated peoples. How dare we assume we know what humanity is, he asks. But when I say we've not discovered it, that we do not know what full humanity is, I don't imply that one day we might. There's no such thing to discover. Earlier I said that since at least the time of Socrates, people spoke of humanity as something to which we are called upon to rise, that it's a task with no end and would have no end even if we lived 1,000 years. That is the idea of humanity that informs what I've been calling a common humanity. And I'm sure that's true of the way most people speak of a common humanity. Reviewing a common humanity, Greg Denning said that, quote, "For Gaita, humanity is a verb, not a noun." I couldn't have put it better myself. Well, to bring this discussion closer to home, it is, I think, uncontroversial that Australian Aboriginal peoples think differently about what it means to be human than non-Aboriginal Australians do. A difference expressed not discursively, but as Stanner put it in the beauty of their song and dance, mime and other arts. Putting this in a most general way, it could be said that the difference lies in their attitude to nature, their place in the natural world. And that's vague, of course, but it's enough to sustain the point that the difference has inevitably shown itself in politics. For example, politics about land, native title, and in the many sometimes bitter arguments about what is sometimes called practical reconciliation, where it's alleged by some, those who like to speak of practical reconciliation, that the real work of reconciliation is being done in that work of alleviating the misery of the Aboriginal peoples, as opposed to what they call mere symbolic reconciliation, which they think to be what self-indulgent leftists do, who have no real interest in the day-to-day suffering of the Aboriginal peoples. Now, the disagreement is about constitutional recognition and about calls to treaty. And perhaps the most bitter disagreements were over whether genocide was at least sometimes committed against the stolen generations, as claimed in the report Bringing Them Home. And I want to comment on this a little, not though with a view to setting new fires burning. Genocide is one of the most controversial concepts in international law. The controversy, it's interesting because on the one side there are lawyers, academic and professional, who accept for the most part what the Genocide Convention of 1948 says, but thinks that perhaps other groups might be included amongst the target groups. And on the other side, there are philosophers and historians and social theorists of one kind or another who argue, amongst other things, about whether in order for there to be genocide, there must be mass murder, clearly knowing that the Convention of 1948 doesn't require that. And the other big disagreement is about whether the Holocaust should be regarded as a paradigm for the application of the concept of genocide, or whether it is, as indeed the person who developed the concept at first, or coined the term genocide, Lemkin, believed that the Holocaust is merely an extreme example of something, at the other end of which perhaps we have coercive integration. Bringing Them Home consists largely of heartbreaking stories. And the argument that genocide was committed against the stolen generations is brief in it and depends on the definition of genocide in the Convention, which allows, as I said before, that there may be genocide without a single killing in the service of a genocidal intent, and that taking the children of a group may be a means to genocide if it's done with the intention to destroy that group in whole or in part as such. That's the phrasing of the Convention. Now, what I'm about to say, for anybody who knows my work, is a retraction from things I've written in the past about this. Stories, I've argued elsewhere, cannot of themselves tell us whether the allegations in the report are right. No stories, no matter how moving, can settle the controversy about the nature of genocide. In the West, where the concept was developed, stories or extended narratives like Primo Levi's If This Is Man which played such an important role in our understanding of the Holocaust, such stories speak to us only against the background of a common understanding, which is the work of discursive thought, usually in disciplines like anthropology or philosophy or history, social science, social theory, to try to render reasonably perspicuous. But there are two important qualifications to that. First, the kind of thought that engages with the stories should be answerable, I believe, to the same critical concepts that determine the degree to which the stories contribute to understanding, not just to edification or pleasure, which are, of course, partly those concepts used in the assessment of literature. There can be no marked distinction, I believe, between the concepts with which we critically assess narratives and those to which discursive engagement with them is answerable. In some of my work, I've called the cognitive realm in which narrative informs a distinctive conception of the discursive, the realm of meaning. And some of you may be familiar with that expression. I wouldn't like it to be taken as a technical one, though. The word realm gives it a slightly intimidating ring, I fear. When I coined it, I had in mind ways of thinking about the meanings of things in our lives, about what it means, to, as I said before, to love or to grieve truthfully and why it matters, about what it means to suffer wrong and what it means to do it. What counts as thinking well or badly about these matters is in part determined by concepts more often used in the assessment of literature than in philosophy or in the other social sciences. Concepts like sentimentality, pathos, cliché, tone deafness, for example. Thinking about the meanings of things in this way is necessarily answerable to such concepts because they partly determine its cognitive character. I call it a realm, I could have called it a domain or a space, because I thought of the concepts that determine the character of such thinking as constituting a conceptual space or realm in which thought and feeling, style and content are inseparable. Those concepts mark its distinctive cognitive character, and therefore the forms of the discursive that can best engage with it. And for that reason, reflection in the realm of meaning should never wish to distance itself too much from the natural languages that nourish it. Because those languages are steeped in the contingencies of history and culture that shape and are shaped by the lives of peoples, reflection in the realm of meanings is inescapably in medias res, in the midst of things, to a degree that even philosophers like many Wittgensteinians, who emphasize the dependence of our concepts on ways of living, would find unnerving. Bringing them home was criticized as being emotional. People argued that it convinced people that genocide was committed against the stolen generations only because those people had let their reason give way to emotion. Kim Beazley, some of you may remember, wept in Parliament when he read out some of those stories. It is, of course, a failing, sometimes a very serious one, to be emotional in the pejorative sense of the term. For then we ignore or deny facts and arguments that are not congenial to beliefs to which we're emotionally committed. That's usually what people have in mind when they stop being so emotional. Hold on to your reason, they say, especially in turbulent times, rather like holding onto your hat in a storm. But there's a danger that threatens our capacity, indeed our desire to see things as they are, against which we seldom protect ourselves or even notice the need to do so. It's the tendency to oppose reason to emotion in a way that makes us insensible to or uneducated in a form of understanding in which thought and feeling, form and content are inseparable. Sentimentality, a disposition to pathos, a failure to register what rings true, a tinea for irony, these undermine understanding more often and surely than when emotion usurps reason, if reason is conceived as separate from and unfriendly to emotion, fearful to be swept away by it. When that happens, it's not because emotion defeated reason that we affirm beliefs we later regret holding and having acted upon when we become morally more clear-sighted. It's because we were bereft of a sensibility, educated and disciplined, that would have enabled us to detect the sometimes crude, sometimes sophisticated sentimentality, pathos and so on, in what seduced us, often propaganda. Thus, what we think being emotional comes to will depend on whether we distinguish thinking well from thinking badly, according to a conception of the cognitive in which cognitive content should always be separated from form, or whether we think of it as I've explained when I talked about the realm of meaning. I come now to the second qualification. There is no shared understanding, for the most part, between Aboriginal peoples of Australia and non-Aboriginal peoples about what it means to be human. And a fortiori, I would say, no shared understanding of what we would naturally think of as crimes against humanity, if the concept of humanity plays any serious role in the ethical characterization of those crimes. Aboriginal peoples now, it's important to acknowledge, have no political power or military power in the land. They cannot force anything on the non-Indigenous populations, cannot force them to negotiate about anything, about treaty, for example. Awful though that must be to people treated as Aboriginal peoples were treated by their colonisers and their descendants, whatever further justice they are given will be a function of the openness of non-Indigenous Australians to seeing that justice must be done and seeing what that comes to, if it's to be true to the history of this land. And that means Aboriginal peoples must come to see what's at issue, non-Aboriginal peoples must come to see what's at issue from the perspective of Aboriginal peoples. That requires more than we usually mean by empathy, because it depends on acquiring new concepts or modifying old ones, concepts that are a condition of empathy rather than its product. Only then will justice truly be done and seen to be done. And often this involves a kind of gestalt switch of the kind that, for example, would enable one to see this land as still being under occupation, if not legally, as defined in international law, but morally, nonetheless. If you think that's an exaggeration, a step way too far, then listen to these words of Pat Dodson. Quote now. While the 1788 invasion was unjust, the real injustice was the denial by Governor Phillip and subsequent governance of our right to participate equally in the future of a land we had managed successfully for millenniums. Instead, the land was stolen, not shared. Our political sovereignty was replaced by virulent forms of serfdom. Our spiritual beliefs denied and ridiculed. Our system of education undermined. We were no longer able to inculcate our young men with the complex knowledge that's acquired from intimate engagement with the land and its waterways. The introduction of superior weapons, alien diseases, a policy of racism enforced biogenetic practices, created dispossession, a cycle of slavery, and attempted destruction of our society. The 1997 report, Bringing Them Home, highlighted the infringement of the UN definition of genocide and called for a national apology and compensation of those Aboriginals who had suffered under laws that destroyed Indigenous societies and sanctioned biogenetic modification of the Aboriginal people. End of quote. To see Australia like that, really to see it, will be, for most people, at first at least, rather like experiencing first one aspect and then another of an ambiguous drawing. Full understanding of the crimes committed against the Indigenous peoples of this country depends then on an ethical understanding of what they suffered. And that depends upon a deepened understanding of their conception of what it is to be human. Understanding of that can never be too distant from their stories and other forms of art that express that suffering. That was the importance of my first qualification. And if that is so, then it's obvious that for the most part, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples of this country do not share a common understanding of that suffering, and therefore of what is necessary to the characterisation of the crimes, a full and proper characterisation of the crimes committed against them. And development of such an understanding is likely, obviously, to be challenging and radical, and almost certainly will bring into play concepts that are novel to the classical tradition of Western political thought. When people's souls have been lacerated by the wrongs done to them, individually or collectively, openness to their voices requires humbled attentiveness. There's little evidence of such attentiveness. Martin Buber said that the basic difference between monologue and fully valid conversation was, quote, the otherness, or more concretely, the moment of surprise. His point was not merely that we must be open to hearing surprising things. We must be open to being surprised at the many ways we may justly and humanly relate to one another in a spirit of truthful conversation. It's in conversation, rather than in advance of it, that we discover, never alone but always together, what it means really to listen and what tone may properly be taken. In conversation, we discover the many things that conversation can be. No one can say what will happen when we understand how Aboriginal peoples experience the crimes committed against them, and therefore how we will understand those crimes, their ethical dimensions, how those ethical dimensions will affect our understanding of their legal dimensions, of what makes them crimes indeed. As I said, the Aboriginal peoples now have no power worth speaking of. If their voices are to be heard, if they dare speak from their hearts seriously to challenge our assumptions about who they are and what a just political arrangement can look like in this country, then it will only be because the non-Aboriginal population will have been sufficiently moved by the spirit of justice to listen. Then the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples may even discover what kind of we they are able to speak together. We may discover then the we that justly represents our political destiny, and we may discover that it's no longer we Australians. We might even change the name of the country. Maybe not. But I can't see how one can respond with humility to Dodson's words without allowing that to be a possibility. What I said about genocide would apply to much international law. Indeed, that's one reason why I chose the example of genocide tonight. People sometimes think that the principles of law must be sufficiently abstracted in order to gain the consent of people with divergent ethical beliefs. And that's true, of course, up to a point, but only up to a point. If, as I'm sure is true, no one thinks the ethical dimension of rape or torture, for example, are irrelevant to what makes torture and rape crimes. And it's a truism that international laws that constitute the nations of the earth as a community of nations, or could do so, must express values that are in some sense universal. And what kind of universality is that? What kind of universality is presupposed in the very idea of international law? It's natural and common to think that the universal values expressed in international law are principles that can be abstracted from the cultures of the nations that are answerable to those principles. Those values, this thought continues, could be and ideally should be expressed in a language that consciously prescinds from the local, historically conditioned associations and resonances of natural languages. But there's another way of thinking about universality. It's suggested by the idea that great literature potentially speaks to all the peoples of the earth, but only is translated from one natural language into another. Our understanding of these and what it means to commit and to suffer the crimes prohibited by international law, what it means, for example, to commit or to be a victim of genocide, is often deepened by art. When film, a painting, a play, or a novel, or a poem moves us, for examples. And art provides a different model for universality than does science, or a political or moral philosophy that seeks to abstract universal principles from the concrete circumstances of peoples who are intellectually and spiritually nourished by the ways they've been rooted in particular cultures. As things stand, the preambles to some of the most important instruments of international law that I mentioned earlier deploy Eurocentric concepts to express the ethical significance of those laws, to reveal what it means ethically to break those laws. Amongst them is the concept of human dignity, or the dignity of humanity, the alienable dignity of each human being. Elsewhere, I've expressed deep reservations about the way we speak of human rights and human dignity. Indeed, it was in one of the other lectures under this title. In the way we talk about these with a capital D, because, for example, we call it with a capital D because it's so obviously different from the dignity that we fear to lose when we become demented, let's say, or whatever. Like Simone Weil, I feared that our commitment to human rights rests on an illusion, reinforced by the way we talk about dignity or inalienable dignity, that no matter how unrelentingly savage or cruel our oppressors are, we can retain a dignity that they cannot touch. But some people suffer affliction so terrible, whether through natural causes or because of human cruelty, affliction that crushes their spirit so completely that the heroic key in which we talk about dignity and inalienable human rights sound like whistling in the dark. But I've also argued that the battles for what we call human rights and for the acceptance that all the peoples of the earth share an inalienable dignity that defines their common humanity have been amongst the noblest struggles in Western history. God only knows where we would have been had we not fought and won so many of them. To my mind, therefore, the presence of those Eurocentric concepts, driven from natural law and from Kant, are not thereby bad ones. I spoke earlier of my fears for the world that my grandchildren will grow into. I dread the prospect of a world in which my grandchildren could no longer affirm, for it is an affirmation, an act of faith, to be true to what love has revealed and reason cannot secure, that even the most terrible wrongdoers, those whose characters appear to match their deeds, who are defiantly unremorseful and in whom we can find nothing from which remorse might grow, that such people are owed an unconditional respect, always and everywhere owed justice for their sake as human beings. Thank you.